Weird, right? Like Canada's right there. We should know about it, but I don't think we do. At least I didn't. Is this gonna work? Thank you, Ms. Miller. All right. So what do we see here? What is this? This picture of stop sign. You guys are awesome. Are you guys in driver's ed? Yeah. Some people are good. I'm glad you guys know what a stop sign is. That's pretty key. What is special about this stop sign though? It has another language on it. Do we know what that other language is? French. Awesome. So what this is this is a picture of a stop sign from Canada. So this stop sign from Canada has stop written in both English and French. Does anyone know why that might be the case? Yeah, Miss Lehman.
Because so when Americans go there and can read.
Okay, so that there's English, so that people who speak English can read it. Do we know why the French is up there? Because what language do they speak in Canada? French. They speak French in only one part. Do we know what part that is? Nobody knows? Right? It is in the east. You said it. Quebec. So Quebec. And so remember, that is our essential question for today, is why did Quebec try to... Whoop. Is it going to let me go? There we go. Why did Quebec vote to secede from Canada in 1980 and 1995? So what's pretty special about Canada is that they are they have a dual language system. They are a bilingual country. They speak both English and French. And the key to this is what we're going to be looking at through this history is why is there both an English and a French-speaking part of Canada, and how do those parts interact with one another? How do the English people and the French people within Canada interact with one another, and how did that impact this secession movement? Now, do we know what the word secession means, or to secede? To remove, to get away from. So have you guys learned about the Civil War? Right? So during the Civil War, the southern states, the Confederacy, they wanted to secede from the Union. They wanted to leave the Union and go form their own independent country. Okay? There we go. I'm going to figure this out eventually. All right. So the first thing, if we're looking at the history of Canada, and from this slide, the only key thing I want you to know is that Leif Erikson is often credited as the first European to encounter the Americas. Right? What is the story that we're traditionally told growing up? Who discovered America?
Christopher Columbus.
Yeah, as a class. Christopher Columbus, right. And so what his history has kind of shown us is that's not necessarily the case. Right? The Vikings, and more specifically Leif Erikson, they were making journeys to the New World 400 years, almost 500 years before Columbus. This is around the year 1000 that Leif Erikson traveled. He left Greenland right here. So Greenland is here. Leif Erikson, made this short journey over to North America. He did establish a settlement there. He called it Vinland, but this was not a permanent settlement. The settlement did not last very long. So we don't often credit the Vikings as being the settlers of the New World. So the next thing, so this was around the year 1000 AD that the Vikings and Leif Erikson in specific traveled to North America. Now we don't know, we haven't nailed down his precise landing spot in North America. We think it's anywhere from like the East Coast, so think like Virginia, the Carolinas, that region, all the way up into northern Canada. Somewhere along that large swath of coastline is where he landed. And again, we don't know exactly where. But what really kicks off the exploration age is what? What happens in 1492?
Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
Exactly. Christopher Columbus sails the ocean blue. So in 1492, the concept of the New World, or the concept of the Americas, is imprinted upon Europeans. Columbus comes back. He was trying to sail to China, but he comes back and realizes, hey, I found this new thing that was there. And so the first European to really explore the land that we would know as Canada was an Englishman by the name of John Cabot. So remember, Canada has is mostly English, that bilingual government, they speak English. So English settlers had a pretty important role in Canada. Now the dates that I'm going to show here, I don't necessarily want you guys to remember these dates, they're more just for our reference. So in 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. So 5 years later is when exploration of Canada begins. So within 5 years of the discovery of the New World, people are starting to explore what we would know as Canada. And this man, John Cabot, he was an Englishman, and what he did is he explored Canada, but he didn't necessarily claim land holdings. Right? Do we know when explorers went out, what did they usually do when they landed on a new piece of land?
Mapped it.
They mapped it. What else did they do? They marked it. Yeah, you got?
They claimed it.
They claimed it, exactly. So they would land on an island or they would land on a coast and they would say, I claim this land in the name of whatever government they represent. But John Cabot didn't do this. He didn't claim a whole bunch of land for England. Because at this time, England wasn't a superpower. They weren't interested in acquiring colonial possessions across the sea. And it wasn't until 1670, so this is almost 170 years after the English first started to explore Canada, that they set up their first permanent settlement. Now this settlement was in the Hudson Bay. So over here on the map, this large body of water here, this is what's known as the Hudson Bay. I know you guys on that wall, I might not be able to see super great. But the Hudson Bay, so this was an area of land, all the land around here was claimed by the Hudson Bay Company. This was a privately owned corporation that the government of England gave the land to. The government of England said, we don't really want this land, we want all the natural resources that it can provide, but we don't want to govern it. So they allowed a public or a private corporation to do that, the Hudson Bay Company. They corporately owned the land. Okay, and that was the first English settlement, or the first instance of English control over what we know today as Canada. Gosh, okay, this is backwards. Down is forward. Alright, so next is the French. The next thing we're going to look at is the French. Because remember we said we're going to try to figure out why Canada speaks two languages, why they have both English and French. And so the French, they're actually the ones who did most of the exploration of Canada. They're the ones that mapped out much of Canada. They're the ones that settled much of Canada. They're the ones that controlled much of Canada for several hundred years. So again, remember Columbus, 1492, sailed the ocean blue. So in 1534, a Frenchman named Jacques Cartier, he sails down the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So this is the first French expedition into what is the New World. Again, this is about 40 years after Columbus. Now the St. Lawrence River is this body of water right here. So he traveled down, and through here there's a river and you can get all the way to the Great Lakes. This was the first area of settlement by the French, the area around the St. Lawrence River. Why do we think that that was the first place they settled? What could you take down this, dang it, what could you take down this right through here? What could you bring in there?
Boats.
Boats, exactly. So what they did was they took their boats in the river and they just traveled it as far as they could go. They said, let's see how far we can take our ships into the land. And once they reached a spot that they couldn't travel any farther, that's where they set up shop, right? That's where the city of Quebec is located at, is at that point where you can't take a boat any farther down the St. Lawrence River. Now it was almost like 70 years before another French explorer really made an impact on Canada. And this was a man by the name of Samuel de Champlain. Champlain, I don't speak French, I apologize. So he is the Frenchman who did the most for French Canada. Or what they called it at the time, they called it New France. Okay? So in New France, Samuel de Champlain, he's the one who took French exploration from just up here and expanded it into this area. He explored the Great Lakes, he explored parts of Michigan, of Wisconsin, he came down across what we now call the Canadian border and did much more exploration of the inner parts of Canada, okay? Going away from simply where you could get with a boat and going more over land. And this was further replicated by a duo, Father Marquette and Louise Joliet, who in 1673, they traveled down the Illinois River and down the Mississippi River. Okay, they're the ones that explored what we would call Illinois, parts of Indiana, and then down through the Mississippi, all the way, they traveled all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, okay? And what's really kind of cool about these guys, do you guys know where Creve Coeur is? On the other side of East Peoria? Has anybody ever heard of Creve Coeur, Illinois? Okay, so Creve Coeur, Illinois is actually the site of the very first French fort built in Illinois. Okay, these two, Father Marquette and Louise Joliet, built a fort in Creve Coeur, and that's where we get the namesake of the town from. Okay, it was the first French settlement in Illinois and one of the oldest French settlements in the New World. And so before we go, I kind of want to take an opportunity to look at this map. Right? It's kind of a map-heavy day. I think there's a map on almost all of these sections. But I think the maps are very important in understanding the dynamic here. So the land in the red, that is land that was owned by England. Okay? Where do we see most of England? Their attention was focused on this area here. What is this area here? The 13 colonies, right? So England, their primary focus in the New World was the development of those 13 colonies. This is the land up here that was owned by that private corporation, the Hudson Bay Company. So England had a claim to this land, but the government didn't run it. Everything else we see in the blue, this is New France. So this is French control over this land. France, rather than being more concerned about colonies the way that England was, France was concerned more with natural resources. They were big into the fur trade, the timber trade. They used the New World as a way to get natural resources, where England used the New World as a place to put people. Right? England think it's a very small island. They were running out of room. So the colonies allowed them to send people over the New World to make more room at home. And so this is going to become important when we look at what happened next. And what happened next was called the French and Indian War. Now the French and Indian War, or you might hear it sometimes called the 7 Years' War, because it lasted for 7 years, was a conflict not between the French and the Indians. It was a conflict between the French and the English. We call it the French and Indian War because the French allied themselves with the Native Americans. Okay, English people, because they were focused on colonies, they had far more citizens in the New World than France did. So France needed to rely upon the native populations to help bolster their army, which is why we call it the French and Indian War. Now, if we remember back to that map, France had a ton of territory in the New World, and England didn't have very much. But England wanted, there were some, if I go back to the map, these areas here, these are disputed areas. So an area where France says we have control and England says no, we have control. And that is one of the main causes for the French and Indian War, was they were fighting for control of the Ohio River Valley. Now the Ohio River today is the border between states like Kentucky and Indiana and Ohio and Illinois. And it's this main thoroughfare to take you from the Appalachian Mountains, and you have access to the Gulf of Mexico. Now at this time, why do we think that a river valley would be so important to these countries that they would be willing to fight a war over it? What is important about rivers? Yeah. Luke.
You can ship stuff down them.
Exactly. You can ship stuff down them. Do we have any other thoughts? Because there are other good things about rivers. Trade. What types of things live around rivers? Animals. You got more?
Say like fish.
Fish. So there's a lot of natural resources that are associated with rivers. Think of timber. Plants grow around rivers because it's a water source. Animals live around rivers because, again, they're a water source. And like we said, transportation and trade. At this time, there are no railroads, and there are no real roads throughout the New World. So the main way that you transport goods to market is over rivers. And the Ohio River Valley is also very plentiful in natural resources. Think things like timber, things like animals. The fur trade was really, really big at this time. So like beavers and muskrats and other animals who could be used for fur. They all resided in the Ohio River Valley. So that's why that this war began as a fight for control of this area. Now England emerges victorious. They beat France. And so what England does is they say, you know what, we only wanted the Ohio River Valley, but we're going to take all your land regardless. Right? They didn't really want the rest of the land that French had, or it's not that they didn't want it, that wasn't one of their main focuses, but they were happy to take it after they were victorious. And what this does is this ends French occupation in the New World. France is no longer a power, and they never would be again in the New World. So at this point, this is kind of the turning point, right? If we come back to our essential question for today, why did Quebec want to secede from Canada? It is because of these two things. I would point to these two as the start of the problem. So first we have the Quebec Act. So in 1774, again, we don't necessarily need to remember these dates, they're more for reference. So we have to kind of imagine what life was like in Canada at this time. So in this time, when the English take over, there's a very large percentage of the population that considers themselves French. They are descendants of the French people, they practice French culture, they speak the French language. Now can anyone tell me, do England and France historically get along, or are they historically enemies? They're historically enemies. So the French, they were worried because their enemy, the English, had kind of a hostile takeover. They had taken over the French people's lives, and the French people couldn't really do anything about it. So they were really, really concerned that their rights were going to be trampled upon. So to counteract this, the English government passed the Quebec Act, which promised to continue French law, protect French freedoms, and most importantly, or because this is opposite to the English, it preserved Catholicism. Now the English, they do not practice Catholicism. They are members of the Anglican Church, which is the Church of England. So there's this religious battle that's kind of going on, right? This competing ideals. That's one of the things that Quebec citizens really hold on to. So what this act did is it preserved French culture in North America. And then a few years later, what they did was they split Canada into two. They made an upper Canada for English people, and they made a lower Canada for French people. Now, before we get too far, can anyone tell me why I believe that these are the start of the problem, or can be looked at as like kind of the initial reasoning for why the secession came up? What do you think is wrong, or why do you think this could potentially cause problems in the future? Does anyone have any ideas? Alright?
Because maybe the English people wanted to spread their culture.
Okay, so the English people want to spread their culture, while the French people want to spread their culture, so we have the competing ideas, right? Got an idea, Dwight?
They're gonna try to keep like pushing to get more of Canada, like the upper Canada, and like English is gonna try to get more of lower Canada.
Yep. Okay, so the two are going to be competing. They have different interests. Yeah, Phelan?
Well, because they haven't been spending time like adapting to each other's cultures.
Exactly. These people are not adapting to one another. They are not assimilating with each other. What has happened is the English created two distinct cultures, but then forced them to live next to one another. So these two cultures, they're not working together to create something unique. They're kind of off living in their own zones, right? The people in Lower Canada are living like they're French, and the people in Upper Canada are living like they're English. And what this does is creates two distinct cultures within Canada that we're still dealing with today. It is this cultural identity that is created through the Quebec Act and the Canada Act. Okay? So then to kind of go off that, what happens next is Canada begins to expand. Now if we go back to the Canada Act where they split them into two, theoretically that sounds like a pretty good idea, right? The government they created gave equal representation to the French and equal representation to the English. Because when you only have two groups, you can do that. You can give 50% to one and 50% to the other. But what happened when, in 1867, when the Dominion of Canada, that's kind of the first time Canada is seen as a unified entity, what happens is they added new provinces. Now in Canada, they don't have what we consider states, they have provinces. So you can kind of think of them along the same lines as you would think of a state. It's kind of this a grouping, and it's used more for like local government. But what happened is when two new provinces were added, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, what did that do? So it used to be that Quebec had 50% and Ontario had 50%. What is Quebec's percentage of the Canadian government now if there's 4 of them? 25, exactly. So what happens is Quebec has now become a minority. When they were originally, when it was just Upper and Lower Canada, there was no minority or majority, they were both equal. But now Quebec is a minority because these new provinces, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, they are English. And every province that Canada is going to add from here on out is going to be English. So now there's 10 provinces within Canada. So we've seen over the years, Quebec's minority, they used to be a 25% minority. What are they now if they're 1 out of 10? They're a 10% minority, right? So that number keeps going down. They become a smaller and smaller portion of the Canadian population as more provinces are added. And so what this did was it forced the Quebecers, which doesn't sound right, but that's the plural for people from Quebec. But so Quebecers, they had to fight hard to maintain their French culture. They started to become somewhat insulated. What does it mean when a society or a culture becomes insulated? Do we know? Yeah.
They're by themselves.
Exactly, they're by themselves. They're not allowing outside influence to come in, and there's no inside influence going out. So they start to separate themselves from Canada, and they start to establish this culture that is distinctly Quebec, not distinctly Canadian. So it kind of deals with their national identity or their national perception of themselves. So what this expansion does is it sets the stage for Quebec to want to leave, right? They're constantly living as this minority amongst the Canadian people. Their rights are somewhat being trampled upon. So when the U.S. created their Constitution, one of the key components of that Constitution was the Bill of Rights. You guys familiar with the Bill of Rights? Like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, those type of things. The Canadian Constitution did not have a Bill of Rights until 1982. So part of what the culture within Canada was is Quebecers believed that their civil rights were being trampled upon. They believed that they weren't being, represented. They weren't being represented well within the Canadian government. And so this further created this concept of they wanted their own nation. Right? Do you guys remember talking about the Kurds?
Yeah.
And how the Kurds are a distinct people group with a distinct cultural identity that desire nationhood? Now the Quebecers, they're not that extreme in their desire for nationhood as the Kurds, and they don't have the complicated past that the Kurds have. But it's kind of the same idea, right? It's this group of people living within a country that wants their own independence. They want their own nation. And so the turning point, again, this is a couple hundred years that these ideas are kind of festering and building popularity amongst the Quebecers. But then in 1976, a man by the name of René Lévesque was voted the Premier of Quebec. Now the Premier of Quebec is kind of like the governor. So he would be like the governor of Quebec who would go and represent the province in the federal government. And he ran on an openly separatist campaign. Now a separatist is someone who wants to separate themselves, kind of like a secession. You can kind of use those two words interchangeably, separate and secession. And so in 1980, he called for a referendum. Do we know what a referendum is? Yeah, Nuri?
When they call the people to vote for something.
Exactly. So they called the people to vote upon it. So what they did is they put out this referendum, this idea that says, hey, vote yes or no on Quebec leaving Canada. And so what happened was they had a big election within Quebec. People could either vote yes or no on whether they wanted to leave. And ultimately the vote was no. Ultimately they nixed the idea of becoming an independent nation. But what it did was it created a lot of buzz and a lot of pressure on the Canadian government to change. And that change came in the form of the Constitution Act. Now this Constitution Act reworked and remade the Constitution of Canada, And as I said earlier, this is when the Bill of Rights gets inserted into the Canadian Constitution. Okay, the Bill of Rights, and it was an attempt to preserve the rights of the French citizens. It was an attempt to appease the people of Quebec and let them know, hey, you are just as important to our country as our English-speaking people are. Now, the government of Quebec, they didn't like the new Constitution. They didn't think it did enough to preserve their national identity. It didn't do enough to preserve their culture. So they never signed the document. To this day, Quebec, the signature of Quebec is not on the Canadian Constitution. And I don't necessarily understand how that works, how you can have a province that didn't sign the Constitution. But again, like I said, I don't know that much about Canada. But anyway, so this Constitution Act of 1982 kind of seemed to settle the problem, right? It seemed on the surface to have solved the issue of Quebec nationalism. But in reality, all it did was further the desire for Quebec to leave. So 13 years later, in 1995, they hold a second secession referendum. Now that first one, it was voted no, and about 60% of the people voted no, and about 40% of the people voted yes. Now, but the one in 1995, this one was decided by 1%. You see up there, 50.5% of the people voted no, 49.5% voted yes. So this is razor, razor thin, right? This is a flip of a coin. It could have gone either way. And what's so important about this is that this is contemporary history. This is within my lifetime. This is something that isn't historical in nature. It's something that is not necessarily present, but it's within current history. So it's something that's going on. And I think it's so interesting because we view Canada as a first world nation, right? And this isn't a problem that first world nations have. They don't have issues of parts of their country trying to secede. And so it shows us that our national identity and the way that we perceive ourselves is super, super important and can play a large role in the world and of the country. So before we watch these two clips, what do we think about, if we go back to our central question, why would Quebec want to leave Canada? Because Canada's a pretty nice place to live. Like they got free healthcare, it's scenically beautiful, not that many people live there. But what were some of the reasons why Quebec would want to leave? Yeah, culture? That's a fantastic one, yeah.
It's
Full of French people, right? So they don't necessarily fit in with the English people in Canada, right? What are some other reasons? So we have culture, and we have their national identity. What about, yeah, you got more?
Their rights.
Their rights, that would be another one. They perceived themselves as second-class citizens. They didn't, and part of the problem is, even if the government wasn't viewing them as second-rate citizens, does that matter? Or is it more important about the perception? Right? Because I would think that the perception is more important. Even if the government is completely fair across the board, if you perceive that it's not, that's going to be more important, right? Because it's all about how you interpret it. Good. All right, so we're going to end here with just a few videos. Does anybody know who Justin Trudeau is? He's the Prime Minister of Canada. Yeah, so he was in college during this 1995 secession referendum, and we're going to kind of watch a video clip showing him. But this first one, you guys can go ahead and put your notes away. This first one is just kind of footage from it, and you'll see the people demonstrating for wanting to secede. You'll see people demonstrating for wanting to stay within Canada. But I just think it's cool to kind of it's like this real-world representation. And again, this happened in my lifetime, and I had no idea, right? So I thought this was pretty cool.
Et il y aura oui ou non. On vous demande de prendre votre passeport canadien et de le mettre sur la table.
Sovereignty first, sovereignty forever.
So this is a group of people that want to leave Canada. That was the secessionists that protested. And those would be those would be people who want to stay in the country. You see, in this election had the largest voter turnout in Quebec history. Almost 90% of the people showed up to vote. And you see the incredibly close margin. Alright, and so this is a clip showing Justin Trudeau arguing to keep Quebec within Canada.
Today, 18-year-old Justin Trudeau is now a student at a community college in Montreal. It's one of many Quebec colleges gearing up for a referendum next week on the question of Quebec's place in Canada. Justin's position is clear, but as Neil MacDonald reports, Trudeau the younger...
So this is the current Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau.
Point, as was Trudeau the elder.
And his father was also Prime Minister of Canada. His father was the one who created that new constitution.
As they are in long bowling. Nonetheless, the debate is on at 31 colleges among 74,000 students. Arguing the federal case at Collège Jean Brébeuf today was the son of its most famous alumnus.
Le Canada ne chie pas sur le Québec.
Justin Trudeau and his team were lonely voices for the Confederation. Lonely and unpopular. And his opponents, who want a fast track to independence, were cheered before they'd even uttered a word. Later, with a trademark family shrug, the young Trudeau said he doesn't much care what his peers think of his views.
Everyone's got peer pressure at this age. I mean, there's pressure to smoke, there's pressure to do all sorts of stuff. And, I've never been affected by peer pressure. Never.
Students at English language colleges distanced themselves from the referendum when they realized pro-independence groups were paying for it all.
French schools have not taken an unbiased view towards this referendum.
The vote is set for next week, but organizers say they have no intention of presenting the results to the Commission on Quebec's future. They say the vote will speak for itself, a simple and direct yes or no to Quebec's sovereignty. Neil MacDonald, CBC News, Montreal.
So one thing I really like about that video clip is it shows what was going on a college campus. Now with issues like this, societal issues, college campuses are often they don't necessarily represent the view of society as a whole. Why is that? What is unique about a college campus? How old are the people there? They're young, and they're all basically within the same age group, right? Usually like 18 to 22. So you see college campuses, a lot of times, they're very unified in their positions. And that's kind of what we saw there, right? Remember, Justin Trudeau, he was voting to stay, or arguing to stay into Canada, and most of his peers and classmates were on the opposite side, right? They wanted to leave. They wanted to go out and try to make Quebec its own nation. And I just think that was a kind of an interesting way of showcasing it, because you'll see across history, most colleges are on the cutting edge of what would be considered liberal, new ideas and new ways of thinking, right? Like the movements in the 60s, right? Think hippies, things of that nature. It's very, very young people that are often the ones implementing and calling for that social change. All right, Chloe, could you hit the lights for me? Okay, so there is the take-home quiz that is due tomorrow. It's 10 questions. It's all stuff that we've covered in notes, so you guys can go back and reference the notes and doing it. If there's anything you need to clarify, like definitions and stuff, feel free to look those up. But it's located there. You guys are obviously 4th hour, and again, that'll be due by tomorrow.
8 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Yep. Cool. And then continue to read chapter 1 of race. And then next week we will also have our Canadian provinces quiz. It'll be over the Canadian provinces and the Great Lakes. And we're going to kind of cover some of that tomorrow. But you guys can go ahead and get started looking. I believe Mr. Miller sent you guys the practice quiz.
It's linked on the website.
Linked on the website. So you can go ahead and take a look at that. But again, we will be talking about it a little bit tomorrow.
And that will be down here.
And they're pretty easy. There's like 10 provinces and like 3 territories. You guys will do fantastic.
3 questions?
Yes, let's do our 3 questions.
You may want to hit stop on that one.